Daniel had spent his life walking the cold edges of Alaska's wilderness, but on that gray afternoon the forest was quieter than usual. Snow clung stubbornly to the branches even as the season shifted, and the air carried that hollow echo only the northern woods can hold. He was out there to check camera traps for a wildlife photography project, expecting to see the usual forest animals. Foxes slipping between spruce trunks, maybe a black bear still restless after hibernation. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. In a clearing where the undergrowth thinned, a small form lay motionless. At first, Daniel thought it was nothing more than drifted snow or a fallen branch. Then a paw shifted barely just a quiver of fur against the frost. It was a polar bear cub, alone, fragile, collapsed against the moss and ice. Most cubs never wander so far inland. Polar bears live and die on sea ice hunting seals, riding the frozen highways of the Arctic. For one to be this deep in the woods of Alaska meant something had gone terribly wrong. Daniel's chest tightened. His first instinct was, caution, wild animals are not pets, not toys for animal videos, and a cub without a mother can still be dangerous. Yet something in the way she lay there, ribs pushing sharp against her skin sides, heaving shallowly, told him this was different. When he knelt closer, the truth hit him. Her fur was patchy, crawling with ticks, her body thin from starvation. The cub was so weak she didn't even flinch as he reached out. Polar bears are symbols of raw survival, apex predators of the north. Yet here was one reduced to trembling silence, more vulnerable than a stray dog left behind after hunting season. Daniel's voice shook as he spoke into his recorder, part of his field habit. Found a cub. Still alive. She looks no older than 8 months. She can't stand. If we don't act, she won't last the night. That moment carried a weight heavier than any snowfall. It wasn't just about one animal. It was about what abandonment means in the wild. When a hunting dog in rural America is tied to a fence and forgotten people are outraged, but here in the Alaskan woods, the same pattern played out silently. This cub had lost her mother, likely driven inland by retreating sea ice. She was left without guidance, food, or protection. Abandonment isn't always human cruelty. Sometimes it is the collateral damage of a warming planet. Daniel radioed for help, his voice tight with urgency. The rescue team was hours away. He sat in the snow beside her, watching her shallow breaths. He admitted later in his diary, "I was afraid to blink. Every time I did, I thought she might be gone when I opened my eyes again." That fear, the fear of being too late, is something rescuers know well. A veterinarian once explained to me that with wild animals, the line between life and death is measured in minutes. Dehydration, infection, parasites, once they tip past a threshold, no amount of medicine can pull them back. The lesson is harsh, but clear. Survival often hinges not on grand acts, but on someone choosing to act quickly when hesitation would mean loss. And still, Daniel stayed. He pulled his coat around her, shielding her from the wind, whispering words he didn't even remember later. Maybe it was comfort for her, maybe for himself. She stirred once, just a flicker of her eyelid. For him, that was enough to believe she hadn't given up. Hours stretched. A raven circled overhead, the forest settling back into its cold rhythm. To pass the time and steady his nerves, Daniel thought of other rescues he had read about. A grizzly cub pulled from a wildfire zone in Montana. A black bear snared in a trap near Wyoming and freed by volunteers. Each case was different, yet all carried the same fragile thread. Survival depended on someone deciding that one life mattered. He wondered if he could be that someone for this polar bear cub. When headlights finally cut through the trees, relief hit him like warmth after frostbite. Olivia, a veterinary nurse, jumped from the truck with her kit. She knelt beside the cub, brushing fur back to see the wounds her hands practiced yet gentle. "She's still here," Olivia murmured. Then, more firmly, "We can save her if we move fast." The rescue team loaded her onto a blanket, each motion careful, their breaths clouding in the night air. Daniel lifted one corner, feeling the cub's weight shockingly light for her size. That hollowness in his hands would stay with him forever, a reminder of how starvation steals more than flesh. It strips dignity, strength, and spirit. As they carried her toward the truck, Daniel whispered, "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." That night, the forest kept its secrets. Snow fell quietly over the trail they left behind, covering paw prints, covering fear. But for the team, one truth had been uncovered in Alaska's woods. Survival is no longer just about nature's rhythm. It is also about our choices. Because while some will argue that wild animals should be left to nature, what Daniel saw in those ticks in that frail body was not nature's balance, but imbalance. An ecosystem out of step, a cub born into a world reshaped by human impact. Walking away would not have been neutrality. It would have been silence in the face of suffering. This is where perspective shifts. A polar bear cub collapsing in the woods isn't just a wildlife story. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask, when faced with vulnerability, whether in the form of a wild animal, a neglected pet, or even another person, will we recognize their worth? Will we act, or will we pass? Daniel's answer was to act, even when the odds seemed impossible. And in that choice, the cub's journey began. But Jasmine, that would be her name chosen later, was far from safe. The hardest part was only starting. She had survived one night, yes, but starvation, parasites, infection. They were battles still raging inside her small body. The woods had hidden her collapse. The clinic would reveal the full truth of her condition. And so the story shifts from silence in the trees to urgency in a cabin lit by lantern light. What the rescuers faced next would test not only their skills, but their endurance, their hope, and their willingness to sacrifice. The hidden crisis that brought Jasmine to the woods was larger than one cub's suffering. It was a warning about the survival of her species itself. And the deeper the team looked, the more they realized Jasmine wasn't just fighting for her life, she was carrying the weight of a crisis no one could ignore. The next morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the cabin windows, Olivia began her examination of the little polar bear cub. Daniel held his breath with every word she muttered under her mask. She parted the fur gently, and what had looked like dirt in the woods revealed itself for what it was. Clusters of ticks, swollen and dark, clinging to her thin skin. Beneath those parasites, her body was so wasted that even a black bear, fresh out of hibernation, would look strong in comparison. Polar bear cubs are supposed to be balls of white energy, playful, clumsy, curious about every branch and ripple of water. This one barely had the strength to lift her head. Olivia shook her head slowly. "This isn't just one cub's problem, this is a pattern." Daniel frowned. "A pattern?" He leaned closer. That's when she explained something that chilled the room more than the cold Alaskan wind outside. In recent years, polar bears pushed inland by melting sea ice had been wandering into forested areas where ticks thrive. Ticks, once rare in these regions, now latch on to weakened cubs. A healthy cub might fight them off, a starving cub cannot. The combination is lethal. To make the danger clear, Olivia pulled out a small vial where she had dropped the first handful of ticks she removed. Imagine dozens of these drinking from her every day. It's like someone taking a slow transfusion without her consent. She explained how anemia sets in, how blood loss and infection combine to drain life. It reminded Daniel of something closer to home, the way hunting dogs in some parts of the country are abandoned after the season ends. Left in fields or tied to posts, they too are found weak, starved, and often crawling with parasites. The wild and the domestic, the Arctic and the farm road both showed the same truth. Neglect doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from indifference, from systems that leave the vulnerable behind. The more Olivia spoke, the more the parallel grew. Hunting dogs are discarded because they're no longer useful. Polar bear cubs are left stranded because the ice that sustained their mothers has vanished. Different causes, but the result is the same, a living being collapsing under pressures it cannot survive alone. The small lesson here isn't taught in classrooms. Survival isn't just about instinct or strength. It's about context. A polar bear cub born in a stable climate might never meet a tick in her short youth. One born today in shifting Alaska might be fighting parasites before she even learns to swim. Context defines survival, and context is what we humans have changed. We tell ourselves the wild takes care of its own. But that morning I realized sometimes the wild doesn't stand a chance against what we've altered. And yet, within that realization lay a fresh perspective. If human action had helped create the crisis, then human action could also be part of the rescue. Just as neighbors band together to save a dog found bleeding on a roadside, so too could small teams like theirs give wild animals another chance. Each hand pulling a tick, each blanket shared, each meal prepared. It was proof that compassion has no species boundary. To bring the point home, Olivia shared another story. Months earlier, she had treated a grizzly bear cub caught in a snare. He had nearly lost his paw. Local volunteers donated money, brought fresh meat, and even built a temporary pen to protect him during recovery. Against odds, he survived. People think of wild animals as separate from us, she said softly. But they depend on our choices more than we admit. Not to tame them, not to cage them, but to give them the chance to live where we've already taken so much. Daniel thought of the audience who might one day see Jasmine's story. He imagined viewers watching from their homes, people who had perhaps rescued a stray cat or nursed a wounded bird, or simply chosen to support an animal sanctuary through a donation. He knew that if they understood this hidden crisis, they'd see Jasmine not as an isolated tragedy, but as a symbol of something larger. The fresh perspective here is that saving one animal is never just about that one life. It is about pushing back against patterns. Each rescue sends a message that we see we care, and we will not be silent. In the cabin, they continued working. Hours passed as Olivia and another rescuer removed tick after tick, filling more vials, while Daniel prepared bowls of water laced with electrolytes. Every action felt small, almost meaningless against the scale of her suffering, but taken together, they were stitches in a fragile net, holding Jasmine against the pull of death. The cub whimpered once, a sound so soft it barely rose above the ticking of the lantern, but to Daniel it was a roar. It meant she was still fighting. He whispered encouragement as he dabbed a cloth across her muzzle. Later, while the team rested briefly, Daniel opened his notebook again. "She is not just a cub," he wrote. "She is a reflection. If a creature built for the harshest climate on Earth can collapse in these woods, then what does that say about what we've allowed?" The question lingers for all of us. Too often people assume polar bears are distant icons, seen only in wildlife documentaries, their struggles abstract. But here was one lying on a blanket in a cabin, ticks dropping from her body, needing round-the-clock care like any sick puppy or kitten. The mystery is not why she collapsed. The mystery is why we are only now beginning to see it as our responsibility. The team's exhaustion grew as the day wore on, yet not one of them suggested giving up. They knew the statistics. Most cubs in Jasmine's condition don't survive. Yet they also knew that survival isn't decided only by numbers. Sometimes it's decided by persistence, the willingness to stay up all night, to pour hope into actions so small they look invisible until they add up to a miracle. As darkness fell, Daniel looked at Jasmine curled in her blankets. She was still weak, still frail, but her breathing had steadied. He thought of every person watching from afar who might ask, "Does helping one cub matter when the species is endangered?" His answer came not in words, but in the quiet act of adjusting her blanket, making sure no draft chilled her. Helping one matters. Because to that one it is everything, and that truth carries beyond the cabin, beyond Alaska, into the choices each of us makes. Whether it is rescuing a pet, supporting wildlife sanctuaries, or simply sharing stories that spark compassion, every small act builds against the tide of neglect. By the end of that long day, the team had learned more than they expected. Jasmine was not only their patient, she was their teacher. Her condition revealed the hidden crisis of ticks and starvation creeping into polar bear lives. Her survival demanded that they not just treat her body, but acknowledge the bigger story. Survival today is no longer just about nature's rhythm. It is about how we humans decide to respond when we see suffering. And so, as the night deepened and lanterns flickered against cabin walls, the team prepared for the next battle. Jasmine had survived a day, but the truth remained: without urgent medical action, she would not survive the week. The first night would test not only her resilience but the rescuers' willingness to sacrifice sleep, comfort, and certainty. What they faced in those hours was nothing short of a gamble with life itself. The cabin smelled of antiseptic and wood smoke. The little polar bear cub lay on blankets near the stove, her body trembling from exhaustion. Outside, the Alaskan woods stretched into silence, but inside, the team's world had narrowed to this one fragile life. Daniel crouched beside her, whispering words he could not remember later. Olivia, the veterinary nurse, unpacked her kit with practiced hands. There was no sterile clinic here, no stainless steel tables, only rough planks and a lantern swaying slightly in the draught. Yet for Jasmine, this was her only chance. The first task was hydration. Olivia threaded a needle into a vein so small it seemed impossible to find. Daniel held the cub steady, feeling her ribs move weakly against his palms. He had seen black bears in the woods shake trees for berries, seen grizzly bears defend cubs with ferocity, but he had never seen a creature so stripped of strength. When the fluids began to flow, Jasmine's eyes flickered open for a second. Olivia smiled faintly. That's the fight we're looking for. They worked in shifts. One rescuer boiled water for warmth, while another crushed tablets into powder, mixing antibiotics into the broth. Daniel spooned a thin slurry into Jasmine's mouth, waiting as she swallowed drop by drop. Each swallow felt like a victory. Olivia pulled ticks from her ears, her neck, her belly. Every time she dropped another parasite into a vial, the sound was soft, almost unnoticeable. Yet Daniel counted them like tally marks of survival. Dozens became hundreds. His hands cramped, his back ached, but he didn't stop. Later in his diary, he wrote, "Each tick felt like a thief. Removing them was like returning pieces of her back to herself. The exhaustion pressed down on them as night deepened. No one slept. They moved like parts of a single machine, handing cloths, checking temperature, and shifting blankets. It wasn't glamorous, no dramatic music, no flashing lights. It was slow, repetitive, and sometimes tedious work. Yet this is the part of animal rescue people rarely see. Survival is rarely a grand gesture. It is patience, persistence, and faith that small actions add up." Olivia paused, once rubbing her eyes. People think rescue is about one heroic act. Really, it's about hours like this, choosing to stay when you're cold, hungry, and unsure if it will even matter. Daniel nodded. He thought of abandoned hunting dogs he had read about in the lower states, tied to posts left in barns. Volunteers often spent long nights nursing them back with IV fluids and warm meals. No different from this moment. Different species, same story. Living beings pulled back from the edge because someone chose not to walk away. Compassion isn't measured by certainty of success. It's measured by willingness to try when failure feels more likely. As the night dragged on, fatigue blurred time. Someone hummed softly to keep themselves awake. Another scribbled notes on a clipboard recording vitals. Daniel stretched his sore legs, then leaned back over Jasmine, adjusting her blanket again. Her breathing was steadier now, but every breath still seemed borrowed. In those quiet hours, mystery hung in the room. Would she live until dawn? No one said it out loud, but the question filled every pause. Daniel later recalled, "It was like waiting for a verdict you couldn't influence, yet knowing every second mattered if you kept giving." To steady his nerves, Daniel remembered other rescues. A wildlife photographer once told him about saving a fawn tangled in barbed wire, staying with it until dawn, hands bloody, but heart steady. Another time, volunteers had carried a black bear cub out of a ravine in Montana, walking 6 miles in the dark because leaving it wasn't an option. These stories were lifelines, reminders that persistence sometimes turned the tide. What they were doing in that cabin was not so different. They were writing a story, one action at a time, a blanket adjusted, a tick, removed a sip of broth, swallowed. It was fragile work, but it mattered. By the early hours of the morning, Jasmine shifted slightly, curling her paw under her chest. It was the first voluntary movement she had made since they found her. Daniel exhaled sharply. "She's still in there." Olivia nodded, too tired to smile. "That's what we fight for. Those little signs. survival is rarely about one big miracle. It's about countless small acts layered together until the balance tips toward life. People often see the transformation months later, the healthy animal, the strong walk, and forget these hours. But without them, there would be no recovery story, no animal sanctuary to house a survivor, no cute animals for viewers to adore on screens. The quiet, unseen work is where miracles truly start. As dawn finally seeped into the cabin, Daniel rubbed his eyes, fighting tears of exhaustion. Jasmine's breaths were still shallow but steadier than before. Her body was warmer, her lips moist instead of dry. To most, these details would seem minor. To the team, they were monumental. Olivia stretched her sore back, then whispered what they all felt. She made it through the night. That sentence was more than an observation. It was hope. It meant they had bought her one more day to fight. And yet they knew what lay ahead. Removing ticks and rehydrating her had been urgent, but it was only the beginning. Hidden inside her body were infections and deeper injuries no cabin care could resolve. Without surgery and more advanced treatment, her odds were still slim. Daniel closed his notebook with a weary hand. We gave her a night. Now we must give her a future. The team faced a dilemma that would test not only their skills, but their courage. To save Jasmine, they would have to risk everything in surgery, a gamble that could end her suffering or end her life. The decision was not one they took lightly. Morning light revealed truths the night had hidden. Jasmine, the polar bear cub, had survived the field care, but Olivia's expression told Daniel survival was still fragile. She gently pressed her stethoscope against the cub's chest, frowning at the irregular rhythm. Then she lifted Jasmine's paw, showing Daniel the pale pads. "She's anemic," Olivia whispered. "The ticks and the starvation have drained her more than we realized." They drew blood with hands steady from habit, though their eyes betrayed the fear. The results came back quickly, dangerously low. Red blood cells, evidence of infection spreading. To Daniel, it looked like numbers on a page. To Olivia, it meant a choice. No rescuer ever wants to face an act decisively with risky surgery or wait and watch the cub fade. The team gathered in the small kitchen of the cabin, mugs of bitter coffee untouched. Olivia explained the dilemma. Jasmine had a uterine infection, severe and toxic. Left untreated, it would spread through her body. At the same time, the damage in one leg was irreversible. Tissue had rotted from lack of circulation. Removing the infection and amputating the leg were her only chances. But anesthesia itself could kill her, especially with her weakened heart. The silence was heavy. Daniel broke it. "So it's surgery, or goodbye?" Olivia nodded. "Yes, and even surgery might not be enough. Could such a fragile creature endure 2 operations in one? It felt like gambling with loaded dice. Yet not acting meant certain death. Here, explanation mattered. Olivia clarified why waiting was not an option. With polar bear cubs, infections spread faster because their immune systems are still developing. Starvation compounds the risk. "Every hour we wait," she said, "the toxins build. By tomorrow, she might not wake at all." Daniel thought back to stories of abandoned hunting dogs. He remembered reading about one found in a shed in Montana, riddled with maggots and a leg wound. The vet had said the same words: amputation or death. That dog had survived, running joyfully on 3 legs months later. Daniel held on to that memory like a rope. The team wrestled with the cost, not in money, but in risk. Surgery meant using scarce supplies, oxygen tanks, sterile gloves, and antibiotics. It meant hours where exhaustion could cause mistakes. But they also thought of the alternative, carrying Jasmine's body back into the woods if she didn't make it. No one wanted that. Olivia finally spoke firmly. "She deserves the chance. Even if the odds are low, we have to give her a chance." The decision was made, yet the fear did not vanish. Daniel wrote in his notebook, "This is the weight of rescue, knowing that trying might end in loss, but not trying guarantees it." Preparations began immediately. They sterilized instruments as best they could. Daniel checked the generator twice to ensure power for the machines. Another rescuer warmed more blankets near the stove. Every movement carried urgency. Then came the transfusion. A local sanctuary had sent word that a healthy black bear, once injured but now stable, could serve as a blood donor. The logistics were complicated, blood matching transport supervision, yet somehow it aligned. The donor's blood flowed slowly into Jasmine's small vein, a gift from one rescued creature to another. Daniel watched the crimson line enter her body, whispering, "You're not alone, little one. Another bear is with you." There was something profound in that moment. Wild animals, often seen as solitary, were now connected through human hands. It offered a fresh perspective that rescue is not isolated. Each saved life can ripple outward, sustaining another. As the anesthesia mask lowered, Daniel held her paw. "Fight, Jasmine. Please, fight." Her chest rose and fell slower, shallower, until machines took over. Olivia began with the infected uterus, incisions precise, her focus unbroken. The cabin air held no sound but instruments clicking and the steady beeping of the monitor. Hours stretched. Then, without pause, Olivia moved to the leg. Rotting tissue was removed and bone was carefully severed. Daniel could not watch every moment, but he never let go of her paw. Time blurred. At last, Olivia sat back, sweat on her brow. Now we wait. The cub lay motionless, stitched and bandaged. For minutes, nothing changed. Then her chest hitched, shallow but real. Daniel leaned closer. "She's breathing." Relief spread through the team like warmth, but the battle wasn't won. Post-surgery collapse was common. Infection could return. Pain could overwhelm her. Still, for that moment, hope outweighed fear. Courage is not the absence of doubt. Courage is acting in the presence of it. The rescuers didn't know if surgery would succeed, but they chose to risk their own energy supplies and hearts because surrender was unthinkable. Daniel compared it to choices ordinary people make every day. Adopting an unwanted dog, even knowing that medical bills may follow. Rescuing a stray kitten when you're unsure if you can keep it. Volunteering at an animal sanctuary, despite the emotional toll. Each act carries uncertainty, but each says he will not abandon you. As night settled again, Daniel wrote his final note of the day. Her future is uncertain, but at least now she has one. And in that line rests a truth viewers rarely see. Animal rescue is not a series of happy endings neatly tied. It is a chain of decisions heavy with risk, made not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because life deserves the attempt. The surgery ended, but the road ahead was longer than anyone wished to admit. Recovery was not about one day or one procedure. It was about the slow, unglamorous victories, eating, standing, playing. And in the days that followed, the team would discover that resilience grows not in leaps, but in the smallest steps. The first night after surgery felt endless. Jasmine lay curled under layers of blankets, her breath shallow but steady. Daniel didn't sleep. Neither did Olivia. They sat close, listening for every sound, ready to adjust. Tubes wipe saliva or simply place a hand on her back to remind her she wasn't alone. Rescue isn't dramatic most of the time. It's waiting, watching repeating small acts until they stitch into survival. By the second morning, her eyes opened longer, tracking movement in the room. Daniel leaned closer with a bowl of broth, coaxing her gently. She sniffed hesitant, then took a slow lick. The team froze, holding their breath. A second lick followed. Then she swallowed. That was all it took. Hope rekindled in everyone's chest. One swallow after surgery meant her body hadn't given up. Olivia explained the importance of that small act. After major trauma, eating is the first step back to life. If she can keep food down, her body can heal. It sounded clinical, yet the reality was emotional. Daniel thought of other animals he had read about, abandoned hunting dogs, rescued from barns, coaxed to eat rice and chicken by patient hands. The first meal was always the hardest, and always the most important. Every day after the pattern repeated, broth thickened into porridge, porridge into minced fish and rice, then later small cuts of salmon. Daniel stirred vegetables into the mix, blending pumpkin and carrots until it was smooth enough for her weak stomach. He called it medicine food, though he admitted in his notebook that preparing it was as much for his spirit as it was for her body. Cooking became a ritual, he wrote. Each meal felt like a promise that tomorrow would come. Her steps when they came were slower victories. On the 10th day, Olivia guided her, gently lifting her under the chest. Jasmine wobbled on 3 legs, swaying heavily before collapsing back down. The team cheered anyway. Daniel whispered, "You tried. That's enough." A few days later, she managed 2 steps. By the 20th day, she crossed the cabin floor. Each effort was shaky, but each carried the weight of resilience. The work wasn't easy. Her stitches needed cleaning twice a day. Bandages required careful replacement. Pain flared unpredictably. There were nights when she refused food and Daniel's heart sank with fear that she was fading. But Olivia reminded him, recovery is not a straight climb. It's peaks and valleys. "We count the good days," she said, "and push through the bad." Healing, whether of an animal or a person, rarely looks like progress. It looks like failing and trying again until slowly, imperceptibly, the balance tips towards strength. The days grew into weeks. Outside, snow softened into spring thaw, forest animals stirred, and Daniel sometimes heard the distant calls of migrating geese. Inside, time revolved around Jasmine's routine: meals, walks, grooming. Every tick that reappeared was pulled carefully, every patch of fur brushed gently. Her world was small but safe. Daniel found himself writing less about her weakness and more about her personality. She had begun nudging him with her nose, when hungry pawing at blankets, when restless, even letting out a low growl of protest when Olivia cleaned her wound too long. These weren't just signs of recovery, they were signs of spirit. The cub was returning to herself. Examples from other rescues reminded the team to keep perspective. One volunteer shared the story of a grizzly bear cub rehabilitated after a wildfire. It had taken months of feeding, swimming exercises, and enrichment games before that cub regained confidence. Another recalled a black bear that learned to balance after losing a paw in a trap. Each case proved the same truth. Survival doesn't happen in leaps. It happens in steps repeated endlessly until strength becomes habit. This fresh perspective carried the team through exhaustion. Their work wasn't just medical, it was relational. They weren't fixing Jasmine like a machine. They were rebuilding trust between her and the world. Every meal hand-fed, every stroke along her fur, told her that safety existed. Daniel confessed later, "She taught me that love isn't in grand gestures, it's in the patience to show up again and again." Evenings in the cabin grew quieter. Daniel often sat by the stove writing while Jasmine slept. He described how the glow of firelight softened her fur, how her chest rose steadily now, no longer the shallow gasps of that first night. He wrote not only to remember, but to remind himself that progress, no matter how slow, was real. For viewers who see only the end, healthy cubs in wildlife documentaries, playful clips of cute animals, the unseen work may seem invisible, but it is here in the repetition of care that the miracle grows. Rescuers know this intimately. 100 small tasks, most unnoticed, build toward a single moment when an animal stands, eats, or plays without help. By the 6th week, Jasmine surprised everyone. She hobbled from her blankets, crossed the room, and nudged Daniel's knee. It was a clumsy request for food, but it made the team laugh out loud. The cub, who once lay silent in the woods, now demanded meals. That sound, that small insistence, was worth every sleepless night. There were setbacks, of course. Infection threatened twice. Fevers spiked unexpectedly, and once she fell hard enough to reopen a wound. Each time, exhaustion pressed heavier on the rescuers. Yet none considered giving up, because giving up would have meant returning her to the silence of the wood. Victory isn't the final transformation. Victory is every small step that defies despair. And those steps are only possible because someone chooses to stay long after the urgency fades. In the news, people often hear statistics about endangered animals. Numbers falling, populations declining. Those numbers can feel overwhelming. But Jasmine's story showed that statistics change one life at a time. Every rescued cub, every nursed-back dog, every wild animal given sanctuary chips away at despair. It's not about saving them all. It's about saving the one in front of you today. Months later, when Daniel looked back on this period, he didn't remember the exhaustion first. He remembered Jasmine's first lick of broth, her first step. Her paw nudged his leg. Small victories stitched together into survival. But recovery is more than standing or eating. For Jasmine, learning to live with 3 legs meant relearning the very instincts that defined her species. The next challenge wasn't only healing wounds, it was rebuilding the confidence to walk, to hunt, to trust herself again. And that required a kind of patience and creativity few people ever see. Jasmine's wounds had closed, her fur was beginning to thicken again, and the constant shadow of infection was finally lifting. But survival wasn't the end of her story. For a polar bear cub, life was meant to be movement, walking, swimming, climbing, learning the skills that would one day allow independence. For Jasmine, whose body now balanced on 3 legs, rehabilitation was both her next trial and her greatest unknown. The first attempts were awkward. Olivia guided her across the cabin floor, Daniel steadying her from the other side. Jasmine leaned too heavily, stumbled, and collapsed back down. She growled softly, frustrated. Daniel crouched low, meeting her eyes. "You're allowed to fall. We'll try again." She tried again, one step, then another, before wobbling sideways. Every attempt was exhausting, but each one carried a spark of determination. Olivia explained the challenge. "Animals adapt better than we think, but muscles must be retrained, balance rebuilt." With 3 legs, every step is new math. It wasn't just about walking. It was about teaching her confidence again, teaching her body not to fear its own weight. To help, the team built ramps from wooden boards, scattered objects across the floor to mimic uneven ground. They guided her, gently rewarding progress with bits of salmon. At first, she hesitated, pawing suspiciously at the ramps. But curiosity, an instinct strong in all cubs, slowly returned. She began climbing, slipping, then trying again. Daniel remembered other animals he had seen overcome similar odds. A black bear was released back into the forest after losing a paw to a trap. A grizzly cub in Wyoming that learned to climb with half a tail, balancing awkwardly but managing. These examples reminded him that survival wasn't about being perfect, it was about adapting. Resilience doesn't erase scars, it grows around them. Jasmine wouldn't walk like other polar bear cubs, but she could still walk, still play, still live with dignity. Rehabilitation extended beyond the physical. Jasmine had to relearn trust. For weeks, she had known only human care, soft beds, and predictable meals. To prepare her for sanctuary life, the team introduced challenges, placing her food farther away so she had to cross obstacles, hiding treats inside logs, and floating fish in shallow pools to encourage her natural hunting instinct. The first time she swiped clumsily at a floating fish, the room filled with laughter. She didn't catch it, but she splashed water over Daniel's boots. For him, it was more than play. It was evidence that instinct still pulsed in her blood. "She remembers who she is," he whispered half to himself. The process demanded creativity. Volunteers from the local community joined in hauling driftwood, building climbing structures, and donating salmon. A retired carpenter built a low bridge. A high school student sketched designs for an enclosure with snow piles. It was exhausting, often messy, but each contribution reminded the team that rescue was never a solitary act. One evening, as Jasmine wobbled across the bridge, Daniel thought of the families who adopt abandoned dogs. They too must teach patience, rebuild trust, and celebrate each hesitant wag of a tail. The species differ. The challenges change, but the heart of rehabilitation is the same, offering steady hands until the animal finds its own strength. Rehabilitation isn't about making her like other cubs. It's about showing her that being different doesn't mean being broken. There's a fresh perspective in that truth. Too often people see scars, missing limbs, bent wings, clouded eyes as tragedy. But in wild animals, as in people, adaptation can be a story of triumph. Watching Jasmine stand proud on 3 legs forced everyone to confront the idea that wholeness isn't defined by perfection. Progress was uneven. Some days she refused to climb. Other days she surprised them, bounding awkwardly across the enclosure with surprising speed. Each success carried its own reward. Daniel wrote, "When she made it across the ramp without stumbling, It felt like watching a child ride a bike for the first time. The pride wasn't ours. It was hers. For viewers who only see the polished animal videos, the playful cubs, the serene wildlife photography, the truth is harder. Rehabilitation is endless repetition, hours of trial and error, moments of doubt. Yet it is also where the deepest bonds form. It's where rescuers learn patience, where animals learn to trust their altered bodies. Months passed. Jasmine's movements grew stronger, steadier. She climbed small snow mounds, pawed curiously at logs, and splashed in shallow pools. Her eyes, once clouded with pain, now held curiosity. Daniel saw in them the same spark he had glimpsed that first night, the flicker of life refusing to give up. Only now it was brighter, steadier, no longer fragile. How much of her wildness could return? She would never hunt seals on sea ice like other polar bears. That life had been taken from her. But within the boundaries of a sanctuary, she could still live with pride, still express the instincts she carried in her bloodline. And maybe, just maybe, her story could remind people why protecting wild animals mattered in the first place. The small lesson the team carried was that rehabilitation isn't about erasing what happened. It's about writing the next chapter differently. And sometimes the chapters we fear will be the hardest and turn out to be the most beautiful. On a quiet afternoon, Daniel watched Jasmine climb the bridge unassisted, then turned to look back at him as if inviting him to notice. She stood balanced, steady against the backdrop of snow. He smiled through tears. "You've come farther than we ever dreamed." 6 months later, Jasmine's journey would show the world what resilience truly looked like. She had transformed from a collapsed cub into a symbol of survival. But her story wasn't only about her, it was about the hope she sparked in everyone who met her. And that hope would shine most clearly when she stepped into the snow with pride. Winter returned to Alaska with its usual silence, the kind that swallows even the sound of footsteps. 6 months had passed since Jasmine collapsed in the woods, and the cub who once clung to life now stepped out into the snow on her 3 legs with a confidence that startled even her rescuers. Daniel stood back, letting her walk unassisted across the clearing. The snow crunched softly under her paws. She moved slowly at first, testing her balance on uneven ground, but then she picked up speed, bounding forward, her body lean, but no longer frail. For a moment, Daniel forgot she was missing a leg. She carried herself with such pride that the absence felt irrelevant. Olivia watched closely, noting the strength in her stride. Her muscles have rebuilt. She's adapted far faster than the textbooks would suggest. It was a reminder that resilience often outpaces our expectations. Science offers predictions, but living beings often write their own stories. The cub's transformation wasn't only physical. Her eyes, once dulled by starvation, now gleamed with curiosity. She sniffed the air, pawed at snowdrifts, and rolled awkwardly before springing back up, shaking flakes from her fur. She truly played something Daniel had feared he might never see. For him, that simple act carried as much weight as the surgeries or the endless nights of care. The community that had followed her story shared in the pride. Local volunteers who had brought salmon and blankets returned to watch her progress. A carpenter pointed at the bridge he had built months earlier, smiling as Jasmine crossed it without hesitation. "Worth every nail," he said quietly. Her name, chosen in the chaos of those first desperate days, now felt symbolic. Jasmine, the flower that blooms even in poor soil, fit her perfectly. She had grown despite conditions designed to destroy her. She had become a symbol not just of survival, but of possibility. Daniel thought of other rescues, drawing comparisons to remind himself of the broader picture. A black bear cub, once left motherless after a poacher's bullet, now thrives in a sanctuary. A grizzly bear rescued from wildfire smoke, scarred but alive. Each story carried unique pain, but all converged on the same truth. With care, wild animals can rewrite their futures. Jasmine's journey was part of that wider chorus. The lesson Daniel carried from this transformation was about perspective. People often equate survival with merely continuing to exist. But Jasmine showed that survival can transform into pride. She didn't just live, she reclaimed dignity, and that dignity mattered as much as life itself. Viewers might ask, what's the point of saving one cub when polar bear populations continue to decline? Olivia had an answer. Ready. One life saved proves that intervention works. Each success fuels the will to keep fighting for the species. It's not about numbers alone. It's about stories that remind us why the numbers matter. The sanctuary where Jasmine now lived had become part of that narrative. There, surrounded by caretakers and volunteers, she had space to roam snow to play in and safety from the threats that had nearly ended her. Her presence also offered education. School groups visited learning about endangered animals, about the links between climate change and polar bear survival, and about why animal rescue isn't just charity but responsibility. Children pointed at her with wide eyes, whispering, "She's strong." That single impression might shape their values for a lifetime. The fresh perspective here is that survival stories ripple outward. Jasmine's rehabilitation was not an isolated event. It inspired donations, volunteer hours, and awareness campaigns. It reminded people who had lost faith in humanity's kindness that hope was still alive. Even in her three-legged stride, she carried messages stronger than words: resilience, gratitude, possibility. Daniel often reflected on how her journey paralleled human experiences. People scarred by illness, accidents, or abandonment often doubt their worth. Jasmine's pride in the snow whispered back, "Scars do not erase value. Adapting is not a weakness, it is proof of strength." That message mattered not only for animal lovers, but for anyone who had ever felt broken. The mystery that lingered even in her joy was about the future. Would she live a long life in sanctuary care? Would her story change enough hearts to slow the forces threatening her species? These questions had no immediate answers. Yet Daniel chose not to let uncertainty diminish the victory of the present moment. Today, he wrote, "She is alive, she is proud, and that is enough." On a cold morning, Jasmine climbed a snow mound built by volunteers. She paused at the top, three legs steady, nose lifted to the wind. The image stayed with everyone who saw it. A cub once left for dead, now standing tall, as if declaring her survival to the world. For Daniel, it was more than triumph. It was gratitude. Never measure worth by what is missing. Measure it by the courage to stand anyway. And so, 6 months after the collapse in the woods, Jasmine had become more than a rescued animal. She had become a reminder of why animal rescue sanctuaries and community care matter. Her life bridged the gap between statistics on a page and beating hearts in the snow. Yet Jasmine's story was not only about her. It was also about us. The choices we make, the compassion we show, and the belief that dignity belongs to every life. Her survival offered more than pride. It offered a call to remember that sometimes all it takes is one act of care to turn despair into hope. Jasmine's journey could have ended in silence that first night in the Alaskan woods. A polar bear cub, too weak to lift her head, covered in ticks, starving and collapsing in the snow. Most would have walked past, saying nature should take its course, but Daniel and Olivia didn't. And because of that, 6 months later, she walked with pride, steady on 3 legs, her eyes alive again. Her story forces us to ask what survival really means. It's not just about escaping death. It's about reclaiming dignity, about the chance to stand and be seen as more than broken. When Jasmine stepped into the snow, she didn't hide her scars. She showed the world that scars are proof of battles fought and won. That truth extends beyond one cub. Think of the black bear nursed back after a paw was lost in a trap, or the grizzly bear cub pulled from wildfire smoke now thriving in sanctuary care. Each case echoes the same lesson: wild animals, like people, carry resilience deeper than we imagine. What they need is not pity, but opportunity, the chance to try again with support at their side. Jasmine's life also reveals knowledge we too easily overlook. Starvation and ticks are not random misfortunes. They are symptoms of a larger shift. As sea ice retreats, polar bears are forced inland. Their traditional food sources vanish, and parasites once rare expand their reach. A cub's collapse in the forest isn't only a tragedy, it's a warning. Wildlife rescue teams say more such cases are appearing, proof that climate and human choices shape even the most remote creatures' lives. For Daniel, this knowledge didn't remain abstract. It changed how he saw his role. "I used to think rescue was about saving one animal," he wrote. "Now I understand it's about saving faith. Faith that our actions matter." His perspective shifted from the individual to the collective. Saving Jasmine wasn't just about her heartbeat. It was about proving that compassion can stand against despair. Emotion runs through every moment of this story. The fear in the cabin that first night. The exhaustion of pulling hundreds of ticks by hand. The joy of seeing her eat broth on her own. The tears when she crossed the room without stumbling. Each emotion stitched the rescuers closer, binding them not just to Jasmine but to each other. That is something viewers rarely see. Rescue transforms humans as much as animals. The lesson here is one we can all carry. Miracles don't always come as lightning strikes or grand victories. More often they are built from ordinary choices, choosing to stay awake when tired to feed, when discouraged to trust when uncertain. Small actions repeated with love tip the scales toward hope. Jasmine's survival is not hers alone. It belongs to everyone who cared, donated, volunteered, or simply believed she deserved a chance. It belongs to communities that built ramps, cooked meals, and sent supplies. It belongs to viewers who sat quietly, tears in their eyes, realizing that one cub's fight was also their own. Think of the countless animals, still waiting, endangered animals caught in snares, forest animals injured by cars, wild animals left weak by disease. Their stories may never reach screens, but they echo Jasmine's. Each is a test of whether we will look away or reach out. So what does her story mean for us? It reminds us that the world is fragile. Yes, but not hopeless. That every act of care, whether rescuing a stray dog, supporting an animal sanctuary, or even sharing wildlife photography that raises awareness, creates ripples. Those ripples push back against a tide of neglect. Daniel once said, "She made me believe again that kindness can outlast cruelty." Perhaps that is Jasmine's greatest gift. Not only her survival, but the belief she reignited in those who walked with her. And now I turn the question to you. What would it look like if you carried a piece of her story into your own life? Maybe it means pausing before you dismiss a life as too small to matter. Maybe it means supporting a local animal rescue, or simply telling a friend about a polar bear cub who stood again after the world had nearly ended for her. Take a moment to reflect. When was the last time you believed your small action didn't matter? Jasmine proves it does. She is alive because people chose to act when success seemed impossible. If her journey touched you, if you felt her story whisper to something inside you, let that connection stay. Carry it into your days. And if you want to keep walking with us as we share more stories of resilient survival and the wild animals who remind us what strength really means, I invite you to join our community. Like this video if you believe every life has dignity. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story waiting to be told. Because sometimes all it takes is one act of care, one voice raised, one shared story for a miracle to begin.